Hey everyone, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with our weekly update here on social media. Thank you as always for joining us this week. The Constitution is in crisis. Our republic is in crisis because of the Biden administration's reckless, abusive, and political raid on the home of President Trump. I want to talk to you about that at some length today and directly. I was unable to talk to you about it directly last week because I was on vacation, or at least I was trying to be on vacation. But the outrageous Biden corruption thwarted that to some extent. But I'm glad to be back here with you today because there's so much going on and so much background that I want to share with you. I can't talk fast enough to get it out. So I want you to keep track and understand, in the end, this was a baseless, bad faith political raid on the home of the former president, President Trump. The former candidate for office, the prior president, obviously, who would run against Biden and who is likely to be his challenger in 2024. It has no precedent in American history, and as I will explain, the whole basis for it was fraud. And we should be outraged about it. We should be concerned that the FBI and the DOJ have been, we've been always concerned about this. But they, for sure, have been hijacked for political purposes to target the political opponents of President Biden, the Democrats, and the left generally. And when you have federal law enforcement being used in this way to not to advance the interests of the public, not to advance rule of law, not to fairly administer justice, but to target the political opponents of the current administration, that way lies the death of the republic. So these are serious times for our system of government, and the big media would have you believe, oh, the president had classified records, the president had presidential records, oh, it must have been really serious for them to raid it. No, none of that is likely true, as I will explain. And virtually anything that even if it were all true, there was nothing warranting the raid, the dangerous raid on President Trump's home. Now, Judicial Watch has been now for almost 30 years the #1 litigator, I would submit, on records issues. And you're going to hear some phrases thrown out by me today related to laws, and I'll give you a quick glossary. There are several laws related to the handling of government records and access to them. Obviously, there's the Freedom of Information Act, which gives American citizens and others access to information about what the government's up to, certainly at the executive branch level, meaning the agencies of the president are subject to FOIA. And then there's another law called the Federal Records Act, which is a kind of a more narrow law that relates to the responsibilities of federal agencies to create records and maintain records about the activities of the agency. So it goes beyond, it makes it clear that when the government's making decisions, they document them. And then the other law that is of interest to us today is the Presidential Records Act. It's a law that purports to govern the handling and classification of records that the President of the United States uses in the White House. And under the law, he can designate certain records as presidential records and certain records as personal records. I want to say that again. Under the law, the president and the president alone can designate certain records as presidential records to be saved for historical purposes, to be managed and ultimately released potentially by the National Archives, or he can designate personal records. And I don't presumably need to tell you what a personal record means. Practically speaking, it means there are records that he gets to keep and take with him after the presidency. And that's the rub with the sham investigation and targeting and abuse of President Trump. They're pretending the records he had were were presidential and or classified. And I would contend, because the position of the Justice Department has previously been that records the president has after the presidency presumptively are personal. presumptively are not classified, presumptively are not governed by the Presidential Records Act, presumptively are not subject to confiscation by the National Archives or any of its agents, namely the Justice Department or the FBI. But they changed the rules, they've changed the law, and I suspect they pulled a fast one even on the court down there in Florida in suggesting all of this was at issue to justify a raid on his home, when in fact they had no good faith basis to do so. Now, back in early part of this year, when this issue about the president tearing up records and throwing them down toilet bowls, or him actually having to turn certain records back to the archives because they were, quote, presidential records, I remember thinking, and I tweeted as such, that what's going on here? This is a complete change from our understanding of what the law is. Why? Because we had litigated this very issue with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, after he had left office, we found out that he had kept 70, I think it was 78 or 79 recordings, tape recordings of his activities as president. There was an author who was, I think, in his residence, or maybe it was in the Oval Office, or both, it doesn't really matter. And he wasn't just interviewing Bill Clinton, and these weren't his just casual thoughts. These tapes were documenting his presidency in the sense they captured him, according to reports, communicating with foreign leaders, members of Congress, etc. And we had seen that material be publicly disclosed somehow. And back in 2009, back when I was a little kid, we asked for them under I believe the FOIA law, the Freedom of Information Act. We may have invoked the Presidential Records Act because of the intersection between the two. And I won't get into too much complexity on that, but essentially the PRA, once the records become part of the Presidential Records Act process over at the archives and are processed, they're subject to disclosure under law. And the disclosure requirements are similar to FOIA. So it's all kind of bound up in the same approach in terms of public disclosure. So our thinking was, well, how is it the president can take records with him that evidently relate to government decision-making and just say they're personal? And we thought that the Presidential Records Act and the law generally required the archives to go and get them. And this is what happened. The Justice Department, who represented the archives in the case we pursued, said, nope, you can't do it. You can't force them to do it. The president has the right to have the records. They're presumptively his because he didn't transfer them over at the end of his presidency, so we just presume them to be personal. I want to say that again. The lawyer for the archives told the federal court judge that because a president had certain records after the presidency that he had not turned over to the archives at the end of his presidency, they were presumed to be personal. Now, did they tell that to Judge Reinhardt down in Florida when they went in there, waving their arms, waving their hands, saying, oh, he has presidential records, oh, he has classified records? I doubt it. I doubt it. And you can bet that's why they don't want to turn over to Judicial Watch and to you, the American people, the full explanation, the full background as to what they told the judge there, but I'll get into that later. So it was Judicial Watch that fought this issue, and we lost. And so it comes up again this year where they're making this argument that he has presidential records he has no right to. And I was thinking, based on what the government had previously said and this important court decision, that was a lie. They were misstating the state of the law. They were misstating government policy. And I want to explain to you more about this Clinton sock drawer case, as I call it, because it really blows out of the water the idea that President Trump did anything wrong in keeping these records. And, you know, the irony is, on top of that, is the reports are he was still being nice and accommodating and turning over records, pretending, I don't know if he was pretending or not, but at least acceding to the government's argument, well, these are presidential records. And he's like, okay, well, take them. They're classified. Okay, take them. My argument is he didn't have to do either. And if I were him, I would have said, look, these are my records. I understand why you may want some of them for historical purposes, and I'm happy to give them to you. But it's a voluntary disclosure of my personal records related to my presidency. And of course, the Justice Department knew this was an issue, or they should have known, because A, they litigated the case against Judicial Watch. This was a big case. It wasn't that long ago. The decision was 10 years ago. Judicially, that's not that long ago. And it was in the District of Columbia, so it wasn't obscure. And it was by Judge Amy Berman Jackson, one of the leading court. I think is she the chief judge now? Maybe not. Well, anyway, she's a liberal on the court, and she's been around for some time. And I want to read to you some of the material from Judge Amy Berman Jackson's decision, and we'll link to it so you can read it in full. And she provides the background, because I'm reading this to you directly. It's because it just, as I said, you can see why, given this decision, just how corrupt the raid on Trump was in terms of providing evidence that there was no good faith basis for the raid. According to plaintiff, Judicial Watch, President Clinton enlisted Taylor Branch to assist him in creating an oral history of his 8 years in office. In 2009, Branch published a book entitled The Clinton Tapes: Wrestling History with the President, based upon extensive conversations with President Clinton during his tenure in the White House and the events Branch observed when he was in the president's office. Plaintiff avers that from January 20th, 1993 to January 20th, 2001, Branch recorded 79 audio tapes that preserved not only President Clinton's thoughts and commentary on contemporaneous events and issues he was facing as president, but in some instances recorded actual events such as presidential telephone conversations. Based on Branch's book, plaintiff contends that the recordings captured a verbatim record of President Clinton being president. The complaint alleges that the tapes captured a wide range of presidential matters, including potential changes to his cabinet, including whether to fire then CIA Director James Woolsey Jr., or whether to nominate Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State. Foreign policy decisions such as the United States military involvement in Haiti and the contemplated relaxation of the United States embargo in Cuba. I forgot that Clinton invaded Haiti. Jeez, talk about an area worthy of further investigation. But I get distracted. But just Google Clinton and Haiti, you'll see what I mean. President Clinton's side of telephone conversations with foreign leaders, members of the United States Senate and Cabinet Secretary. So the side of telephone conversation with foreign leaders, that typically is material that is inherently classified. President Clinton speaking to several members of the United States Senate, in which President Clinton attempted to persuade the senators to vote against a specific amendment before the Senate. President Clinton's side of a telephone conversation with Congressman Bill Natcher of Kentucky, in which the president explained his reasoning for entering into the North American Free Trade Agreement, based on technical forecasts that he received during presidential briefings. That sounds potentially classified. President Clinton's side of a telephone conversation with the U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher concerning a diplomatic impasse over Bosnia. So all of this is not only obviously related to government operations that are significant in terms of potentially educating the American people about what President Clinton was doing and thinking, but it's on their face, some of it would have been typically classified and would have had to be declassified in order for Americans typically to gain access to them. And all we wanted the archives to do was go get these documents and process them according to law. It didn't mean they would be forced to release everything they had, because I said there are some certain limits as to what we can get. But this is what was being disclosed. And the court told us we should jump in the lake. I'm joking a little bit there, but that's essentially what the court found. The categorization of the records during the presidency controls what happens next. And she was talking about how the Presidential Records Act presumes that the president is the one denoting what is a presidential record and what are personal records. At the conclusion of the president's term, the archivist is directed to assume responsibility for the custody, control, and preservation of and access to the presidential records of that president. The archivist is required to make such records available to the public as rapidly and completely as possible, consistent with the provisions of the Presidential Records Act. The statute, this is key, assigns the archivist no role, again, no role with respect to personal records once the presidency concludes. So let me be clear. Under the law, no one but the president gets to pick what's presidential records. No one but the president gets to pick what are personal records. And the archivist, which is being used as a cutout for the anti-Trumpers in running our government here in D.C., has no authority to second-guess him. In fact, the only limited judicial review of the presidential records decisions are basically a kind of a transparency analysis that certain records are being designated as presidential records when in fact they're just regular old FOIA records that can be released more quickly and more easily. There's no court decision, except this one, as best I can understand it, that give the archives or anyone else in an agency, any other agency, including the Justice Department or the FBI, any authority to second-guess the president here. As I said, a lawyer for the Justice Department, I've got the transcript here, you can look it up, said that because the president, in this case Bill Clinton, did not transfer the material, they're his, they're personal. Again, further in the decision, the PRA requires the president to maintain records documenting the policies, activities, and decisions of his administration, but leaves the implementation of such a requirement in the president's hands. The Presidential Records Act is on thin ice constitutionally. The Congress recognized that, look, the president has prerogatives as president of the United States, head of the executive branch. We can't come in there and manage his day-to-day operations. We can try to make sure that certain records that are created on behalf of the American people that document his activities officially are kept, a la the Federal Records Act. But we can't come in and say, oh no, you should have kept that one as a presidential record and you can't have that one as a personal record. Because that gets too much into the heart of the operations of the White House, which constitutionally is a separate branch of government. But they've blown all that up right now by pretending they can go in and raid his home based on this very dispute. Unbelievable. It's really troubling that a court would have allowed this to take place. The court notes that at the outset that there is broad language in a decision called Armstrong 1, which is a District of Columbia Circuit decision, meaning it was an appellate decision that governs this court decision that we're talking about here, stating that the PRA, it's a Presidential Records Act, accords the president virtually complete control, quote, virtually complete control over his records during his time in office. In particular, the court stated the president enjoys unconstrained authority to make decisions regarding the disposal of documents. Quote, although the president must notify the archivist before disposing of records, neither the archivist nor Congress has the authority to veto the president's disposal decision. And I would go further. If he designates something as personal, he doesn't have to tell anyone what he's doing with them. He can tear them up. But once the records is designated as presidential, that's when this restriction about disposal occurs. Since the president is completely entrusted, again, this is the court decision here, completely entrusted with the management and even the disposal of presidential records during his term in office, it would be difficult for this court to conclude that Congress intended that he would have less authority to do what he pleases with what he considers to be his personal records. That means storing them in a storage room in the basement of Mar-a-Lago. Don't it? Of course it does. And then, of course, the issue is, who gets to second guess the president's determinations? Now, this court is suggesting the courts really can't. In fact, she writes, the court has serious doubts about whether the former president's retention of the audio tapes as personal is a matter that is subject to judicial review. Do you think Judge Reinhart was told that the district court judge that handled a specific case related to a dispute about the nature of records a former president had, that a court found that they had serious doubts as to whether that decision was subject to judicial review? I doubt it. And again, the court further finds the PRA does not confer any mandatory, again, or even discretionary authority on the archivists to classify records. They don't have any business doing it. Under the statute, this responsibility is left solely to the president. While the plaintiffs cast this lawsuit as a challenge to a decision by the National Archives, the Presidential Records Act makes it clear that this is not a decision the archivist can make, and that in this particular case, it is not a decision the archivist did make because President Clinton's term ended in 2000 and the tapes were not provided to the archives at the time. It's exactly the same issue here, isn't it? Of course it is. Another statement by the court. The archivist has no statutory powers related to either the reclassification of records or the retrieval of improperly classified records. I mean, this is pretty damning stuff, isn't it? I think it is. And this is why I've been so insistent about it, and this is why the left has been so angry with me and Judicial Watch for highlighting this beginning in the first part of the year, because I've been talking about this, I've been tweeting it out, and at one point the leftist fact checkers, who are activists to try to destroy and censor and suppress information and opinions they don't like, they called out all these other experts who pretended that what I was saying was bunk, and it wasn't bunk. It's completely accurate. It's based on our significant experience litigating Presidential Records Act, federal records issues over the course of 30 years nearly. Judicial Watch is the nation's, I would submit, leading expert on this topic. And this is what I love. And so the court was making fun of us. I say maybe I'm a little more sensitive than I should be looking at this decision. But she was like saying, well, what is it you want me to tell the archives to do? Raid his home? I don't think even we contemplated that. Maybe if I were arguing the case, I would have said, yeah, raid his home, but our lawyers are more careful than that. Defendant considers this, this is again, the government of the United States considers what we were asking them to do to be an extraordinary request that is unfounded, contrary to the Presidential Records Act's express terms, and contrary to traditional principles of administrative law. And she said, "What you've asked me to order them to go get them." She quotes herself from the transcript here. And our counsel at the time, and he's still with us, Michael Bekesha, he said, yeah, to the extent we asked the court to require them to assume custody and control of the tapes. I mean, it sounds awful that they think we're asking for this court to bang down President Clinton's door and seize these audio tapes. Archives could make a phone call. They could write a letter. There's nothing in the records stating that President Clinton wouldn't just give them the records. We're not specifically saying they have to go seize. And she said to us in response to Michael's good faith offer there, you know, there's ways of trying at least beginning to get the records. Plaintiff's indulgence in wishful thinking in order to minimize the ramifications of its own lawsuit underscores the lack of redressability in this case. So she's telling us, look, there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing I can do about it. The law doesn't give the archives the ability to do anything about it. And because the law is the governing statute here, it unlikely gives anyone else the ability to do anything about it. One option is they can call President Clinton and ask. Our lawyer said, okay. He says no. Now what, the court says? They write a nice letter, which is exactly what they were doing with Trump, and Trump was being accommodating. And yet they raided his house anyway. Something that the lawyers here for the Justice Department never contemplated. The court ruled out, practically speaking, and was contrary to virtually every understanding of the Presidential Act and the deference given to a president in terms of what he's able to do with his own darn records. Case closed. There was no good faith basis for the raid on President Trump's home. And let's pretend they were really interested in classified information. Let's pretend that there were really presidential records they had a right to. Let's pretend there were classified records that shouldn't have been there. Show me another instance where they've done anything similar to any other person in similar circumstances. You can't. I talk about our experience litigating presidential records, federal records, FOIA records. We uncovered Hillary's emails. Let me tell you what we couldn't get the archives to do. To send a letter to the Justice Department asking them to go get the records. Or to initiate getting the records on their own. They didn't want to do that. The State Department, the Justice Department, we just wanted them to send a letter triggering the law, the Federal Records Act, to get records that had been alienated by Hillary Clinton, i.e. stolen. We went to court to force them to do that. They said they didn't want to do that. And the corrupt, unethical, lying Adam Schiff and his gang in the intelligence committees in Congress are demanding what they call a damage assessment, a spillage assessment. When classified information supposedly is in places or gets out in ways it's not supposed to be, they want to do a damage assessment. We sued to get a damage assessment done over Hillary Clinton's leaving tons of classified information on the internet equivalent of a public park bench. They didn't want to do it. Obama administration didn't want to do it, even under the Trump administration. Some of his feckless appointees had zero interest in enforcing the law in that regard or protecting our national security against Hillary Clinton's predations. Hillary Clinton stole records, lied about it. Documents were under subpoena. They were classified. She was keeping them in the equivalent of her bathroom. What, a bathroom server, right? All of that Judicial Watch exposed. Classified records were in her lawyer's office. And what did the government do? Oh, keep those in a safe. That was the end of it. So how do I know this raid was political? Because Hillary Clinton, unlike President Trump, had no right to the records she had. They were classified. They knew they were terribly classified, meaning they had significant classification in terms of the potential damage to national security. And that FBI and Justice Department that just raided Trump's home did nothing when it came to securing those records. Nothing similar when it came to securing those records with Hillary Clinton. The lying Hillary Clinton. Of course it was political. When you have target A, who is a left-wing Democrat, and target B, Trump, in instance after instance, target A is protected, target B is punished. And this is not an application of the rule of law. This is a overthrow of the rule of law to target someone because of your personal dislike as opposed to any actual violations. I mean, I just talked to you at some length about Clinton's tapes. Under their new theory of the law, they should be raiding Clinton's home right now, or at least demanding them back. Do you think they're going to do that? Under their new theory of the law, you can be sure Obama, Carter, Clinton, maybe even the home of George H.W. He's passed away, but he may have records still personal in his home. And of course, George W. Bush and the vice presidents who are similarly situated, practically speaking, the former ones. Are they making sure they have all that all the records that are, quote, presidential, they didn't take? Classified records they didn't, quote, take? Of course not. Because it's about getting Trump. As one of my colleagues said, when it comes to Trump, this is the way to think about it. He who must be destroyed. That's the approach of the Justice Department and the FBI, the deep state, and their acolytes in the media. Joe Biden's hiding all of his Senate records in the state of Delaware, University of Delaware. We've been litigating that issue. Well, he was head of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Do you think he has classified records in that batch of records he's hiding in the University of Delaware? I would presume so. Let's go raid that. The FBI is withholding records from us illegally, contrary to law under FOIA. The FBI going to raid itself? Justice Department going to raid itself for hiding records? I doubt it. So what's behind all of this? It's about getting Trump, of course. Kash Patel has offered the analysis. Kash Patel, former senior official under President Trump, senior guy under Devin Nunes. He's had security clearances. And he's been in the forefront, along with Judicial Watch, in trying to get access to records that Trump had declassified at the end of his administration. I talked about this last time I was with you. And his thinking is this is about making sure that records that Trump might have or might otherwise be somewhere else in the agencies, like Judicial Watch just sued a few weeks for these records about that should have been that are declassified but haven't yet been released per the presidential directive. These records concern the illicit spying on him by the FBI, Justice Department, etc. Were they going in there to find out what Trump had on them? Why should we give them the benefit of the doubt? Judicial Watch has uncovered. Inspector Generals have uncovered. Congress has uncovered repeated efforts to undermine the rule of law by the Justice Department and the FBI in targeting Trump. Remember the FISA warrants. Judicial Watch uncovered the FISA warrants. There were never any FISA warrants that had been publicized or released to the public until Judicial Watch sued and got them. And there were 17, I think the number is 17 material omissions and or lies in those FISA warrants. And nothing's been done about it. One FBI lawyer got a slap on the wrist for a lie related to the FISA warrant process. Nothing else has been done. So there's already a record of them subverting the legal process to target Trump and people around him. And we're seeing it again. They had no basis to spy on him, and they had no basis to raid his home. That's for darn sure. And as soon as this raid happened, Judicial Watch leapt into action. We went to the court and we filed a brief asking that the search warrant be released and other underlying materials be released. And this is what we said. We immediately highlighted the issues at stake to the court. It was Judge Reinhardt. Judicial Watch is investigating the potential politicization of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Department of Justice, and whether the FBI and the Justice Department are abusing their law enforcement powers to harass a likely future political opponent of President Biden. The public has an urgent and substantial interest in understanding the predicate for the execution of the unprecedented search warrant of the private residence of a former president and likely future political opponent. No official explanation or information has been released about the search. As the filing of this motion, the public record consists solely of speculation and innuendo. In short, the historical presumption of access to warrant materials vastly outweighs any interest the government may have in keeping the materials under seal. That's the key phrase. Our public interest, our right to know about this unprecedented, infamous, really dangerous raid, your right to know outweighs any alleged interest that corrupt Justice Department and FBI have in keeping it secret so they can do their fraud criminal investigation. Now, of course, our lawyers didn't say it like that, but that's the way I think about it. Given the political context and the highly unusual action of executing a search warrant at the residence of a former president and likely future political opponent, it is essential that the public understands as soon as possible the basis for the government's action. Any government interest in securing the identities of witnesses and confidential sources, if any, may be addressed by appropriate redactions from the search warrant affidavit. So there you are. We're being nice. Maybe there's a name or two that needs to be redacted. I don't buy it. I think they should release everything. But we understand there's give and take here. We want something. And right after that, within a day or two, because Garland was silent despite the crisis that was caused by his Justice Department's attack on President Trump, he came out publicly, defended the FBI. How dare anyone say anything about what the FBI did or what the Justice Department did? But he acknowledged two things that I think are important. And I'm not quoting him directly, but I think I'm quoting him substantially here. He said that, wherever possible, the standard procedure is to solve these issues or address these issues something in a way short of a raid. So he did something extraordinary. It wasn't the standard operating procedure. And he said something else that was important. He said also, whenever possible, the standard procedure is to have a limited scope in a search. So that means, in this case, the mirror of that obviously is this was an expansive scope. Of course they took his passports. The way that warrant was written, and it was disturbing that the court approved it as written, they could have taken anything, practically speaking. And sure enough, they've got some of the warrant when it was released, thanks to Judicial Watch's pressure, because that was what Garland announced. He said he was going to release the warrant. We got it out. The receipt of the documents the FBI reportedly took was, it included, not reportedly, it's the receipt. You could see it on our website, the potential presidential records. What does that mean? It means anything, right? So we got the warrant, but there's this underlying affidavit and some other materials. And the underlying affidavit's important because typically, I'll warn you, I'm not a criminal lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. But I've seen enough of this material to tell you, I'm pretty sure I know what I'm talking about, that the affidavit is the material given by the FBI, written, usually it's an FBI agent who signs it, detailing what essentially they're investigating and why they think there's probable cause that crimes were committed. And that's where all the details are. What was the fundamental basis for this raid? And as I'm suggesting, it's all based on lies and dishonesty. And I'm sure the affidavit, and it will eventually be released largely fully, I think, will disclose that. Now, of course, the FBI's position, the Justice Department's position, and the court ordered the Justice Department and the FBI to respond to Judicial Watch's demands that this material be unsealed. It was filed under seal, which means it's not public. And so Judicial Watch filed its brief immediately, and then these media organizations came in following our lead, also asking for the material. So the government had to respond to us. That's the great thing about America still. I mean, I know I'm yelling about all of this, but there's still this due process. There's still this process of law that allows little old Judicial Watch to go in there and hold the Justice Department and the FBI, or attempt to hold them accountable under the law for this unprecedented raid on former President Trump. And I'm honored that we're able to do this, and I'm gratified to be in a country that still allows us to do this. And the court, I'm not all that thrilled. The court approved the warrant, but he did move quickly here. And he said the government needs to respond, and they had to respond by earlier this week, and then he quickly held a hearing. Now, the government's response was, we shouldn't have to release anything because it's a criminal case, and it might hurt our criminal case. Well, that's not the rule of law. That's, we don't want to release it. And we're the Justice Department, and that's the end of the discussion. Of course, that's not what the court is supposed to do. And the court rejected that in response to Judicial Watch and the media requests. This is what we said. It seems like the Biden Justice Department is telling the court what to do. Respectfully, the court should make its own independent assessment of the compelling public interest in transparency about this abusive raid. The criminal investigation the Biden administration is covering up reeks of corruption and dishonesty and is based on a reinvention of law about presidential records that is at odds with the U.S. Constitution, court rulings, federal statutes, and prior government legal positions and practice. No administration should be able to raid the home of a former president and putative presidential candidate based on secret reasons. Well, that's actually what I said. That's not what our lawyers said. Let me see what our lawyers said. The public interest in the contents of the affidavit cannot be understated. The secrecy surrounding the search warrant and the affidavit that led to its issuance has caused the nation to convulse with intrigue and harmful speculation that will only increase the longer the truth is kept from the public. The heat must be replaced with light, and soon. Maintaining the seal, meaning keeping the records under seal, will only fuel more speculation, uncertainty, leaks, and political intrigue, and it will also serve to undermine public confidence in the fair administration of justice and equal protection of the law. Concerning the gravity of this unprecedented action by the government, at a minimum, the court should review the affidavit line by line to determine what information may be disclosed and what information may be redacted to balance the competing concerns at issue. And the court agreed with us, and that's exactly what he told the government at a hearing he ordered earlier this week. It was on Thursday of this week in West Palm Beach. Judicial Watch lawyers were there. Our local counsel, Jim Moon, was responding, made argument for us. The big lawyers, big league lawyers for the New York Times, etc., they made arguments. And of course, the Justice Department came in and they tried to make arguments. And the court rejected outright the Justice Department's theory that they should be able to redact everything, because he said, I've looked at this and I've decided, and I'm inclined to agree, that there's certain materials here that can be released. So we won. Now, are we going to get anything released? That remains to be seen, because there's always the right of appeal, practically speaking. But the court ordered the Justice Department to file something, presumably that releases some material, and the court will look at it, and if he disagrees with them, he will call them in and have a secret meeting, what there's called an ex parte discussion with them about the redactions, and who knows where it will go from there. So as soon as next week, who knows, maybe the government will file something the court immediately likes, and we get a new version of the affidavit, or a version of the affidavit that has more information. Or maybe the fight just goes on for months and months and months, which of course is what the Justice Department wants, right? It's about destroying Trump. It's about causing political heartburn for their political opponents. And this has been the case with prior Justice Department, FBI smears and attacks on Trump. They come out with all these leaks and innuendo suggesting that he did something terrible, and none of it pans out. It's what happened with Russia, and I guarantee it's what's happening here. Just as with Russia, there was no good faith basis to go after him and spy on him. And as I've explained to you quite deliberately here and specifically, there was no good faith basis to target him here. So we got this great victory. And I am so proud of Judicial Watch's legal team, the lawyers here, Mike Bekesha and Paul Orphanides, and our investigators and such. They moved quickly. We had excellent local support, as I said, and we took the lead here. But Judicial Watch got the ball rolling. Judicial Watch achieved a key court victory over the Biden Justice Department's desperate move to keep the Trump warrant affidavit completely sealed. The court, as I said, outright rejected the Justice Department's brazen play to keep the whole document secret. The Biden administration's unprecedented and abusive raid on Trump's home has created a rule of law crisis that can only be alleviated with transparency and accountability, and we're thrilled that Americans will get more of both with yesterday's court decision, finding that at least some more information about this terrible raid will be released. So that's great news. So what next? I know there's been talk of impeaching Garland. There's always talk of impeaching Biden. But if I were Republicans, I would be talking about restructuring, if not retooling entirely the FBI and the Justice Department. In the least, I'd be cutting their budget. I mean, what are they there for if they're not going to cut their budget for an agency that is so out of control and abusive? You know, my guess is we're going to find out there was a lot of back and forth about this. You know, they pretend there was this emergency, but it took weeks for Garland supposedly to approve this. And usually that means there's someone around him who doesn't want him to do it. So I'd be interested to know who was that and why. And of course, Judicial Watch, in addition to taking the lead on these in court for transparency, has launched dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests to get access to information about this illegal raid, or what I would call an illegal raid. And so if they don't give us the answers, we'll go to court. That's what we do, because we consider this a threat to our Constitution. And pray for America, because this is so destabilizing to our country for one party-controlled administration to target the head of another party with using such pretextual and abusive tactics. And I really think it's a foreign policy crisis as well, because I'm sure our enemies and our friends are looking at Washington saying, what's going on there? Is that country stable? Is that government stable? So President Biden has contributed to the destabilization of the United States of America in a grave way, and weakened our standing abroad, and weakened confidence by tens of millions of Americans, people in his administration's ability to fairly administer the law. You know, they're pretending that the White House wasn't involved on this. It better have been involved. Is Garland a rogue AG who goes out there raiding presidential homes without approval from the White House? Should be fired if that's the case. And of course, it's not the case. So we've got a crisis. And I know it's upsetting, but what's wonderful is, for those of you who support Judicial Watch, this is how you can do something about it. You can support Judicial Watch. Because as you can see, we're doing the heavy lifting. We're standing in court up for the rule of law. We're explaining and educating the American people about the realities of the records dispute that the Biden administration has manufactured with President Trump. We're demanding accountability and transparency, taking the lead there. We have this unmatched experience in battling about records. So we're the #1 experts on this, I would submit. And we're able to do all this work. We did this work with Clinton 10, 12 years ago, and we lost. But that work helped educate us and help explain the law for future presidents as to what they could and could not do. And it may save President Trump, ironically, right? So I want to thank you for your support, and I want to tell you that if this doesn't demonstrate how important Judicial Watch is, and how useful it is to protecting the rule of law, our nation, and our Constitution, I don't know what is. So those of you who supported our work, I thank you and encourage you to support it more. And those of you who haven't, I encourage you to join our cause and join our movement. And in the least, learn about the records I'm telling you about. Learn about the court decision I'm telling you about. And share it. Because you're not just protecting President Trump, who in my view is a crime victim, you're protecting our constitutional system of government by getting the word out about what the rule of law is, should be, and exposing those who are breaking it. With that, I wish you a great week, and I'll see you here next time on the Judicial Watch Weekly Update. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.